Hi, thank you so much everyone for coming, everyone who I've invited and everyone who's come through Taranja's network. It's a real pleasure to be in this space with you. Just before I share my screen, I just wanted to take a moment because of the nature of my kind of research and practice to just firstly acknowledge the indigenous cultures who have fed into this kind of particular research discourse and kind of offer thanks to them, and also to offer my kind of reverence to our own peasant ancestors who fought so hard to protect skilled labour and access to public land. And yeah, so I hope you're excited to join me on a quick tour through my practice and future projects that I'm working on. I'm gonna so my project before I started the course was Little Black Pants Club. I'll quickly give you a sort of taster of what we do. And this was really my third iteration of working on fashion projects. And I would never have described it this way until kind of coming on the course and sort of exploring new language. But it's a practice that looks at fashion, but in relation to a sacred idea of the body, or a kind of raising the body, and especially the unique individual body, to the kind of center of a fashion practice. Like Taranja is saying, the Commons is very much about care relationships, and because we have a membership rather than a kind of traditional clientele or a customer base, we really worked hard already to put the relationship between me and each person that's kind of purchasing and wearing the underwear as central to how we work and how we design even. And I guess that comes from like a sort of past or an upbringing in social justice, and also, yeah, a kind of deepening awareness of ecology and kind of seeing the body as our first interaction with nature. So our interaction with our own body is kind of our first experience of the natural world, and how that then forms further understandings of nature. We have like a kind of carefully curated or designed business model, again trying to get away from business as transactional in the typical sense, and looking more at communities and how they interact and relate. And so I would see myself as kind of the founder and designer, as the sort of facilitator of a team of makers who are then able to have a relationship of care with our group of members, and all of those members interact with their community in their kind of work or social interactions. And so when we make them good underwear, they're able to kind of form their relationships better, and that is an empowering and positive experience that sort of builds the strength of the community overall. Little Black Pants Club is a bootstrapped organization. So in terms of the kind of economic discourse, we already own our means of production. And we already experience the value of skilled labour because we are a small team of makers, and each of them has kind of been nurtured and trained into the role so that we have a much more supportive relationship horizontally between us, rather than using traditional de-skilled labour, which has then no kind of power or ownership in a sort of traditional factory setting. I think, as a lot of practitioners in fashion and textiles, and probably across a lot of sectors, even though I'm in this incredibly empowered situation of operating in the global north, you know, the sort of intersection of my privilege is reasonably high. We own our studio, and we are able to make and send out product that we make ourselves. Even with that kind of high level of empowerment, as I dig into the the research and the issues around ecological crisis, around neocolonialism, I still find that I'm in this incredibly frustrating position of not being able to create products that properly embody my value system and the change that I want to see in the world, and that I believe is actually just becoming vital for the sort of survival of the world. And this comes down to access to machinery, or access to certain types of production, and access to land. It is not as though the fabrics that I want to use don't exist. And this is very much speaking from the kind of background of my practice before I come on the course, that, you know, this is a great company, Sustainable Textile Supply Chain. They are working with mills. They are developing all the time very high ecological standard fabrics. This single jersey is a stretch, so it's very appropriate for making very functional underwear. And it's a bio stretch, so it will biodegrade at the end of life. It has a very low ecological impact. I'd just like to draw your attention here, where it says the minimum order quantity is 1,000 meters. This is the crux of why I felt the need to come on the Design for Cultural Commons course. 1,000 meters is an approximate investment of £10,000, which in fashion is not a huge amount. It is a huge amount for most people, obviously. And that's just one element of a pair of pants that we might make. We might need to source 5 other components to go alongside that, all with similar minimum order quantities and probably similar investment levels. So you're looking at a big capital investment to start working in the field of sustainable fashion. It relates to 1,000 meters of fabric is approximately 50,000 pairs of pants. Like, this isn't a number that relates to our values of treating people as individuals, of making for the sacred body, of working with someone's direct measurements, of someone being a member rather than just a customer for us. We are always being railroaded down this track of mass production, even trying to work in the kind of sustainable fashion field, just because of the way that the land and machinery is owned and kind of administered, if you like, or used for private profit. And this holds us back in lots of ways. It makes transparency very difficult. It makes innovation almost impossible when you're looking at this, you know, like 50,000 pants to kind of even experiment with a very new fabric. It holds back like deep functionality, because if I was to invest in this fabric, I'm kind of tied to it for a long time. So if it turns out to not work well and not be supportive, not fit nicely, then I'm really out of options at this stage after I've purchased it. And so, having had this experience for so many years, I was kind of driven to want to explore, well, what are the alternatives? What are ways of working that these great thinkers that I'm engaging with, Vandana Shiva, Helena Norberg Hodge, people, even you know, recent research papers at LCF would talk about localism as being incredibly important for the future of sustainable fashion. So how do we actually make that a possibility? How do we manage to like scale down the way that we're working so that it's possible to engender relationships in the way that we produce things, and to have deep functionality, deep ecology and social justice as like radically important criteria in the way that we produce. The Commons offers like a very exciting and also kind of surprisingly common sense mode of thinking about these things. When I've started with a research project into the history of the Commons, partly because it's just so fascinating to me that actually a lot of the enclosures, so this is the kind of parliamentary acts in kind of 2 centuries ago that made what was public land, often woodlands, fields or watercourses, into private property, and took them out of local governance systems. these acts of enclosure were actually super tied up with the development of the industrial textile trade in the UK at that time, and in fact the kind of birth of the Industrial Revolution. So the early machinery, I think the first one was the spinning wheel, the mechanized spinning wheel. So the water-driven spinner. I can't bring the name to mind right now, but it's Richard Arkwright's invention. And so a lot of kind of early industrialization and early colonialism centered around the production of textiles. So it's actually kind of fascinating and sort of difficult to ignore if you are a fashion practitioner. So I looked quite a lot into the direct history of the commons at the beginning of this project. And it starts us on this route where, for a start, land is privately owned, and this has big implications for production of all sorts of commodities, but mostly for governance. So for me, the enclosure of the land becomes this erosion of participatory democracy and the cementing of centralized democracy. The second enclosure, and this is like gets into theoretical enclosure rather than the actual sort of historically written down one. The second enclosure I would talk about is the enclosure of knowledge that comes about with the invention of machinery. And I think actually Dr. Shiva does describe this really well, how knowledge exists in a process already. So a weaver has developed a technology, and a machine loom, or like a mechanized loom, only takes that knowledge and puts it into a mechanism. So it hasn't invented the knowledge of how to weave thread into cloth. And because many of us are not practitioners in that way, that we have like a lived experience of the skill of weaving, I think we can sort of believe that that because it's been mechanized, that it somehow doesn't have a lot of knowledge attached to it. But once you start working with materials, you begin to understand the kind of embodied understanding of the technical limitations of a particular material that you gradually embody as you learn to work with it. And so machinery is very good at taking all of that knowledge. I mean, when they made the stocking frames, which were the first lace making machines, the inventor of those actually watched his wife making lace to make the machine. So he was directly taking knowledge from someone who knew how to make lace and mechanizing it, putting it into a machine, which is all well and good, except for it privatized the ability to use that knowledge to make a living, right? It took the kind of economic potential of that knowledge and gave it to someone in the form of an IP, taking it away from a large group of people who had developed it over centuries and handed it down in a much more kind of generational sort of guild-based way. And the third enclosure for me comes with mass production, in that mass production requires that you make thousands of things exactly the same. And so this divorces us from a kind of real understanding of the body, because it says that the body has to be standard size in order to make things exactly the same, right? We're kind of taking what is a totally flexible, unique arrangement of measurements and volumes and categorizing them into discrete groups. And it never stops surprising me how many people can look normal sized or look like they are a size 10 and still have the experience of clothes not fitting them. And this is because a body can't really be a size 10. A body is a completely unique organic thing that has sort of grown, whereas a size 10 tries to make the body into like something that a machine can deal with, whereas a human can very much deal with an individual's uniqueness. Mass production can't. And I think the effects of this are really being very well described by things like the body positivity movement. Although I would say they don't go far enough by just asking for representation. It is time for us to acknowledge our uniqueness as individuals and make that part of our understanding of community. For me, I'm really inspired by this idea that there is a political hegemony formed by the way that things are produced. And I think that's when you kind of hear this idea, you can kind of see it playing out in the way that things are kind of just handed to us in global North culture. We don't really take part in their production, and I really feel like that is also become part of our understanding of like democratic process, accountability and governance, that we don't, it's not something that we feel we take part in or are able to take part in, have an active role to play in. And so for me, kind of shifting narratives around production and shifting our experience of production is also a way of shifting a kind of the Inuit or the inertia that exists in the way that we are able to hold our kind of government and our and decision makers accountable to us. So I see it as kind of a bigger cultural shift than just a change in shopping habits. This is becoming like quite a common narrative amongst thinkers in sustainable fashion, the idea of localized textile processing. And it does relate back to that idea of the hegemony that it creates. Localized textile processing allows people to have a direct experience of A, what goes into making textiles, and B, what the effects of the way that we do it are. So if you know that your river has been poisoned by certain chemicals that are coming from a textile factory, you have a lived experience of why that should probably change. At the moment, we're very much divorced from having that experience, and therefore it's hard to garner the kind of needed passion to make the proper changes in the way supply chains work and in the way processing is working at the moment. It doesn't mean that localized textiles processing needs to completely replace any other kind of textile processing. But I do think it's an important piece of the puzzle, even in the narratives around how we are going to move to a sustainable or hopefully regenerative future. And this diagram is to kind of break down the various processes involved in, for instance, making a denim, because sometimes it can be hard to kind of visualize those. And also it's looking at what is the resource that's available to us, because we don't grow cotton in this country, and we can't unless we have big greenhouses, which I think is probably not the best idea. But we have a huge amount of textile waste, and I have it on record from one of the recycling experts at the Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership, that the logistics around recycling actually make it much more logical to do it in a locality where the finished, where the recycled material is going to be used. Again, issues of accountability and transparency are greatly reduced when you're doing something in a locality where people can have a very direct relationship what you're doing, can have a lived experience of it. So this is a kind of map of Brixton, which is where I operate, and it's talking about the practices that already exist that I'm able to kind of form connections with, which I think is already like exciting and a very positive process. So this is me here by the state. This is the station. This is M&S. This is us in a railway arch. There is a project called the Fabric Floor, and I'm in touch with a few of the makers there. And again, there is already a drive for personalized fit, customization. One of the people that I work with is Denim Recon London, and they make made-to-measure jeans. A really great practitioner. This is my fantasy of replacing H&M with a Brixton Tailors cooperative doing all made to measure. I think it's really important to think about kind of dispersed wealth systems, because thinking about the quality of work that we're able to access and that people are able to access, a lot of people kind of cite the argument that, you know, that a kind of smaller scale fashion industry would necessarily lose jobs. And I think that's actually not the case. we work much more intensively in terms of the number of people who are producing the small number of pants that we make. So we have increased the number of jobs to provide for the group of people that is our membership. We have to increase the value proposition to sort of make more sense. And I think also we have to think about quality of work, and again, that relationship of care that can exist within a small organization, and can exist within a locality where garment workers are in direct relationship with garment wearers, that a big outfit like H&M just can never really provide. This is the Brixton windmill, where we are looking at planting a dye garden. I'm working with a couple of botanical dyers, one in Brixton and one in Hackney, and we've been working on projects for Little Black Pants Club. But it's also been really exciting to kind of start to form a coalition of like-minded practitioners who have been thinking along similar lines, and actually a commons is beginning to emerge organically through these kind of conversations. And that's really my motivation for giving this talk and for kind of making my thinking available, is to start to gather together the coalition of people who are going to spread and continue what we're doing, and make it a new kind of normal. And then this is a lovely old mill building where I intend to and hope to cite the outcome of my project, which I imagine is fairly obvious what I'm going to say at this stage, but I am interested, excited, passionate about the creation of a common pool resource mill for the milling of fabrics within Brixton. And I have been so lucky to be able to link up with Cordwainer's Dye in Hackney to kind of work on this project. So this is the unofficial launch of our week-old website. They are going to give it to me. Failing that, we are going to purchase one of these, a spinning machine, which takes the kind of unprocessed fluff and makes it into usable thread. And this is a circular jersey knitting machine, which makes basically t-shirt fabric or pants fabric if you are a pants maker. Ownership of this machinery allows us to make in small quantities, the quantities that are relevant to the practices that we are creating. It allows us to experiment with fibres, with recycled fibres, with various waste fibres from agriculture as virgin fibre inputs, with regenerative fibres, with UK-based fibres, with biodegradable elastanes, which at the moment I can't get my hands on in less than 10,000 metres. It allows us to have an embodied experience of the making of textiles, and it allows other people like me working in this way access to the production of textiles, which I find very exciting, but maybe it's just because I'm a massive fabric geek. The cost of this is approximately £60,000. Funding is a huge issue, and if anyone here is a textile practitioner and is coming up against the issue of funding, we go to the London Urban Textiles Commons website. We're running a workshop in a week or so, but the date is flexible, looking specifically at creative approaches to funding, because it is very important to do a project like this and for it to work that we own this machinery outright. Otherwise, it's not, we don't own it. We don't have a commons. As long as we're having to pay rent, we're forced to behave in the same extractive way that other mills are having to behave. And so looking at how we get that capital into projects like this is the big question. And I'm not just saying that because I wrote one funding application and didn't do it. and didn't get it. I've been on multiple accelerators. I've spoken to multiple parties. I've looked at various funding applications, and they all relate to high growth strategies. On the Centre for, the Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership Fashion Accelerator, we were told, base your pitch on how you're going to make the investor rich. I'm not going to make an investor rich. I'm going to make like regenerative, exciting pants for lovely people. That's the crux of my work. So looking at new methods of funding is absolutely crucial to how this is happening, how this is going to be possible. And I think knowledge sharing around that becomes a commons in itself, because it's a way of making the information available for future projects to work, for other people in other sectors to do something, for a commons mill to exist in Manchester and Liverpool, etc., etc. And so this is my first idea. This is something that I've drawn on from Little Black Pants, because essentially by running a subscription model, we have a kind of long-term crowdfunding sort of way of working. And so my test, if you like, my sort of active learning experience is going to be to spend 1 year crowdfunding to make the community mill, commons mill possible. And at this stage, I'm treating this almost as a kind of pilgrimage, almost as a kind of spiritual commitment to this future that I want to see happening. And so it will be very much around and this is something that we talk about on the course a lot as well, the kind of socialization, or the education, the embedded learning that's important to make these ideas exciting to people, and to kind of bring the coalition together that can make something like this happen. So with this £120 t-shirt, you will have a 1,000th part ownership of the Brixton mill. And I wonder if that's exciting to people. Obviously, that's the first test, certainly exciting to me. But also, how does it become exciting to people? How do people begin to engage with the idea of commons ownership, of participatory making, of being involved in things? And that's going to be the project that I'm going to embark on for the next year, is testing and reassessing and rebuilding that process to bring this group of people that want to see this happen together. And so one of the first projects that we're looking at is a kind of version of a harvest, just very simply centering a festival around the breaking down of sort of end-of-life textiles, ready to be spun into new ones. And these are the kind of projects that we develop quite a lot on this MA course, is practices that kind of sit between an art practice and a learning experience, in terms of having a taste of, having an interaction with this future imaginary that we're bringing into being. And so as a lot of me and the cohort are looking at a kind of ecology of commons, or ecosystems of commons, where things feed into each other and learnings feed into each other, and also the information that's generated from them can feed into bigger and future projects around the area and also in other areas. And I think that's another thing about the beauty of commons thinking, is that when you localize something, you make space for other people to exist alongside, rather than centralizing a practice and kind of pushing people out. You're creating the conditions for more practices to exist, to be kind of have this autonomy and enriched experience embodied in them.